This video is brought to you in partnership with Geologie. Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome to Lost in Adaptation, the little corner of the internet that's dedicated to discussing the nuances of turning a thing into another thing. I am currently still avoiding talking about any film releases in support of the current SAG strike, but fortunately, films are not the only adaptations out there. In 2014, Justin, Travis, and Griffin McElroy, known for their popular podcast My Brother and Me, sometimes abbreviated to Mabimbam, a comedic advice show that involved them giving very bad but very funny advice to audience writing questions, teamed up with their father, former radio host Clint McElroy, to start The Adventure Zone, a 5th edition D&D podcast. Griffin, the only one in the group with significant experience playing D&D, took the role of the Dungeon Master. Justin chose to play a flamboyant elf wizard celebrity chef named Taco. Travis went with a human fighter called Magnus Burnsides, and Clint a dwarven cleric named Merle Hightower. While not as popular as juggernaut D&D podcasts like Critical Role, The Adventure Zone gained a pretty substantial following, even outperforming Mabimbam due to the family's comedic approach to the game and their amateur status actually making the podcast more accessible to non-D&D players, as it provided a chance for them to learn the rules of the game with them. The first series, which became known as the Balance Arc, ran for 69 hour-ish long episodes over the course of 3 years. The first chapter was loosely based on an official D&D pre-prepared plot from a campaign book called The Lost Mines of Flandelver, but after that they switched to homebrew original content. While the Balance storyline concluded in 2017, the Adventure Zone itself is still ongoing to this day, transitioning into multiple other arcs and role-playing games, with each member of the family taking turns assuming the role of DM. Shortly after Balance ended, it was announced that the McElroys intended to adapt the first 10 episodes of the podcast into a graphic novel in cooperation with cartoonist and webcomic artist Carly Peach. It came out in July 2018 and became the first graphic novel to top the New York Times best-selling trade fiction list. Unsurprisingly, this success led to the next 4 sub-arcs of the story getting their own novels, with the 5th currently scheduled to hit shelves next year. On a personal note, even though I was a big fan of the podcast, I have never been particularly interested in these novels, but that was mostly because I've just never been much of a comic guy, just a personal preference. But I have read them now, and I got opinions. Quickly, just as a comic and not an adaptation, I think it's pretty clear that a lot of effort went into its creation. To my great relief, this is not a lazy cash-in. There's 1 or 2 coloration issues in the first volume, and a few occasions where the art style reduces the epicness of things that should be epic as fuck, like the flying moon base for example, but I think it serves the character's expressiveness really well. That's all I got though, because as I just said, I'm not particularly knowledgeable about comics, so let's talk adaptation instead. Regarding the setup, they apparently decided not to go full hog and depict the D&D game as a D&D game with all of the McElroys involved, but it was important to them that Griffin got his fair share of representation in the comic, which meant having to allow a certain level of meta-awareness in the story. What they evidently landed on was Magnus, Merle, and Taco being aware that they are characters in a D&D game, while not being explicitly aware that they are Travis, Clint, and Justin. This is a pretty good balance because it allowed for more of the original jokes and interactions between them than if they'd only adapted the fiction, while keeping the stakes life or death for the characters. Story-wise, the comic is surprisingly all-encompassing despite the 70 or so hours of podcast it's adapting, largely because a good 50% of the pod's runtime is the McElroys goofing off and getting distracted. Volume 1, Here There Be Gerblins, covers the trio starting their adventure as hired mercenaries, meeting fan-favourite characters such as Clark the Bugbear and Barry Bluejeans, finding the legendary evil magic relic, the Phoenix Fire Gauntlet, utterly failing to prevent an entire city from being burned to nothing, and getting recruited by the Bureau of Balance, the secret organization dedicated to trying to stop this sort of thing from happening, led by the mysterious director. Volume 2, Murder on the Rockport Limited, establishes the Voidfish, a giant jellyfish that can erase all of the memories of something from every mind in the universe, the boys accepting the job of tracking down the remaining 6 relics, starting with one that's locked on a fantasy train, meeting Angus, the boy detective, fighting Jenkins, the murderous conductor, and sending the entire vehicle into the void to prevent it from making a high-speed crash into a city. BT dubs irrelevant tangent incoming, but one of the things the McElroys did to engage their audience was name new characters after people who tweeted at them, and I happen to know the Lehman Kessler, whose namesake is brought up so much in this volume despite him being dead the whole time. He's a comedic H.P. Lovecraft impersonator on YouTube, and I think he's also the mayor of his town now, which is a fascinating career path. Volume 3, Petals to the Metal, actually covers one of the lunar interludes, the one-episode breaks between arcs designed to give the DM and the players a chance to concentrate more on character development and advancing the plot. The boys then get sent to retrieve the next relic from someone known as the Raven, are horrified that Merle uses seduction to get them by a wall of sapient vines, get drawn into taking part in a death race with the Raven's girlfriend based on somewhat convoluted logic, win but end up having to fight her for the relic anyway, after which they're confronted by a lich in a red robe that tries to warn them not to trust the Bureau. Volume 4, The Crystal Kingdom, starts on Candle Nights, their version of Christmas, and chronicles the lads having to navigate their way through a floating science laboratory that's slowly being magically transmuted into pink crystal by the out-of-control Philosopher's Stone, during which Merle loses an arm, the Red Robe makes another attempt to bargain with them, they rescue the ghost of a little girl living inside a robot, find out the Grim Reaper himself is gunning for them because, according to him, they've already died multiple times, just don't remember it, get the multi-planal nature of the world explained to them, and they let a mad scientist off the hook because they felt bad he was just trying to bring back his lost mother. And in Volume 5, The 11th Hour, the guys get stuck in a time loop in a Wild West-themed town, befriend an Earth golem named Roswell, help rob a bank, meet the Goddess of Destiny, resist the temptation to be allowed to erase the biggest mistakes of their lives, do an Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom-style thing with a Dune-style worm, and Magnus discovers that he might have a past that he has no memory of. And that's as far as they've got until next year. All of it is true to these storylines that they slowly but surely etched out over the course of years, in between long tangents, making fun of Clint for being obsessed with casting Zone of Truth. Seeing Garfield the Deals Warlock, a joke storekeeper character carried over from a Joker that originally started in Mabimbam, was pretty funny. Griffin never gave him a visual description, so fan artists tended to draw him as the lasagna-loving cat of the same name. The comic makes a cute nod to this without violating copyright by having what is very obviously him appear in a mysterious cowl and robe. This being the first podcast to other media I've reviewed, it was very interesting to have to consider what would be considered source material accurate and what wouldn't. For example, the players would occasionally jokingly add lines of dialogue to Griffin's NPCs, and on occasion these unauthorized additions made it into the comic script.
Oh Jesus, Jerry, no!
He just had a kid.
He is horrified.
While no two people are ever going to imagine something the same way, Peach clearly put a lot of effort into recreating what Griffin described as closely as possible, something the McElroys have publicly sung her praises for on many occasions. And finally, a somewhat rare thing in the history of this channel, a few things that weren't changed but probably should have been. Adapting the humor of the podcast, which as mentioned was a huge factor in its success, to comic form was clearly a challenge. There are some examples of things that were just a straight-up bad idea in concept, like attempting to recreate a gag about Griffin making funny noises in a soundless medium, or a bit that was originally just a reference to a recurring joke on Mabimbam about actor Kelsey Grammer. There's other occasions where they tried to include jokes that there's nothing wrong with in principle, but just don't land the same way in the new medium because they were originally funny almost solely because of the delivery. Take one of the very first jokes of the comic, for example. Here's a side-by-side comparison.
What are you doing?
I am probably studying my cantrips.
Just preparing.
Just say masturbating, Dad.
I'm deep in thought.
Don't come in, Mom. I'm studying my cantrip.
Because something about this whole thing stinks.
Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think the joke itself was all that funny, but the gang's reaction to it is. You find yourself laughing at the fact that these lovable, immature chuckle nuts are laughing at something so stupid. And that was the key to a lot of the Adventure Zone's charm. You felt like you were laughing with the McElroys, and without that, I was getting a little bit of a Friends Without the Laugh Track feel from the graphic novel.
Ross invited us all to watch.
Griffin would later take responsibility for a lot of these missteps, admitting he pushed too hard to keep certain jokes, despite Justin predicting exactly what happened, that things that were very funny in the improv comedy vibe of the podcast wouldn't have the same impact when they were written down. This sort of thing would be a recurring problem throughout all of the novels, but to their credit, less and less so with every volume, as they were very clearly learning from their mistakes. And now, a quick word about this video's partner. If you'll forgive the blatant autofellatio, I can say with all sincerity that I often get asked, Dom, you beautiful example of the human species, how the heck are you 36? Well, the answer is skincare. It is motherfucking skincare. Geologie is a 27-time award-winning skin, hair, and body care company recognized in Men's Health, Hypebeast, Birdie, Esquire, Ask Men, and Oprah Daily Grooming Awards, and boasts over 7,000 5-star reviews from customers. Geologie products can reduce oiliness, prevent wrinkles, combat dark or puffy under eyes, and give you that good hydrated skin with easy-to-stick-to routines that are tailored for each individual, ensuring that commitment feels natural and easy. This was my first time using Geologie, but I've already found it very helpful with my acne, which is something I've struggled with since I was like 12. I've got to say it is frickin' liberating not to break out every other week at the most inconvenient times anymore. Also, as a amateur skincareist, I was very relieved that the products I've been using were numbered in the order I was supposed to use them, so you can avoid shifting through endless products. Geologie has distilled skincare to its essentials with trusted, dermatologist-approved ingredients. And I have a pretty sweet deal set up for y'all. If you use my code DNOBLE70, Geologie will give you 70% off their award-winning skincare trial set, which means you're getting over $49 in products for just $15. On top of that, you can get an additional bonus offer of up to 50% off one of the skin, hair, and body add-on products when you add it to said trial. This is a limited time offer, so if you're interested, you should act now. Sometimes when I do these essays, this segment in particular has an overtone of critique. I've been known to be somewhat judgy of the decisions made in the adaptation process, so I would like to stress that in this case, a lot of what I'm about to mention is stuff that they could not or should not have carried over into the comic. I am just describing what the end product is like versus the podcast, not implying that they should have done it differently. On occasion, mostly in the first volume as that was the one arc based on a campaign book, certain things had to be renamed because they were technically the legal property of Wizards of the Coast, the company that owns the copyright to Dungeons & Dragons. Clark became Ganesh, Neverwinter became Eversummer, you get the idea. Of the story beats, most of what's left out is the random encounters or similar such fights that were fun in the context of playing a game but contributed very little to the overall plot. For example, they skipped over when they had to fight a room full of robots to prove themselves to the Bureau of Balance, or when they were attacked by a group of giant leeches after crash landing outside of Rockport, or had a zero-G fight with giant tardigrades. They also quietly removed other random tangents that were very funny at the time, but also didn't contribute to the main plot, like Magnus getting really high right before leaving the moon base.
Avi,
Yeah?
do you want to go on a mission?
I can't. It's my job.
Okay, we'll meet you down there.
I won't be able to.
Avi.
Yeah?
Shh. Be cool for 2 seconds.
Okay.
We'll see you down there.
And after their first meeting, they worked all of the boys' dealings with Garfield the Deals Warlock into whatever they were doing at the start of their quests, instead of stopping the narrative for them to go to Fantasy Cast Go, where all your dreams come true, we got a deal for you. Every time. An interesting change that I would like to highlight, though, was the fatal mistake that they made that destroyed the city in the opening chapter. Originally, they got screwed over by a vengeful orc teenager they had rescued on their travels, making the first act of mercy in the story the thing that cost thousands of people their lives. However, none of the players ran with this possible character moment, electing to be humorously unaffected by the entire event for most of the story, so the comic replaced this character with someone who would actually be making a return later. But, as I alluded to earlier, the vast majority of what is missing from the comic compared to the podcast was the absolute chaos of this family messing around for 3 years. The DM's sarcastic responses when someone tries to do something that doesn't make sense within the mechanics of the game, the running gag that Clint needs constant reminders to use his character voice, new characters rapidly evolving as soon as they appear because Griffin would yes and some stupid joke suggestion thrown out by his players, and the minutes-long segments of him coming up with different character voices for them, and the guy straight up doing the wrong thing for 20 to 30 minutes while Griffin tries to nudge them back in the right direction with mostly ignored NPCs. For me personally, personal opinion, no implied expectation that you should agree, this was another reason why I wasn't super interested in these novels despite being a big fan of the podcast. podcast. All the stuff I just mentioned was why I liked it. It was a good story, but I was there for the laughter and the chaos. On a more positive note, they were able to use this adaptation to correct some inconsistencies in the story that came about due to Griffin not having fully figured out every aspect of it right from the start. For example, director LaQuisha, who it's revealed in the climax has actually known the player characters for over 100 years before she gave them amnesia, actually reacts to unexpectedly seeing them again after over a decade apart. The Red Robe gets introduced much earlier, and other minor characters like Lord Artemis Sterling, the Lord of Neverwinter, also get established sooner with early cameos. They also do little things like have Magnus act injured when he's been beaten down to his last hit point, something that few D&D players are method enough to do in the moment. By book 3, they appear to have become slightly more willing to skip a few episodes worth of plot for the sake of more traditional comic book style humor, like a smash cut between them promising not to kill anyone and them dumping Big Jerry's body off a cliff. In book 5, they started getting even more creative with it, adding things that were never directly described in the podcast but were part of the lore, dropping important parts of the lunar interludes into flashbacks to help break up the chapters, and combining minor NPCs into single characters to keep the narrative flowing more smoothly. While I usually advocate for the more loyalty to the source material the better in adaptations, in this case, it seems that the more willing they were to take some liberties with the events of the podcast, the better the comics became over time. And finally, amusingly, a few volumes in, they started playing down just how badly the gang treated NPCs like Clark and Angus, possibly out of a fear that the hilarious abuse of Griffin's characters would be less funny when you're looking at them being dicks to what is supposed to be an actual child. Final thoughts. So, are these graphic novels accurate to the plot of the game that they played on the Adventure Zone? Abso-bloody-lutely. Everything is streamlined, but they got all of the key plot points, the artist nailed the visuals, and the characters felt super similar to how the McElroys played them originally. From a storytelling perspective, it's hard to imagine what they could have done any better. Are they a good representation of the podcast as a whole, though? I just don't think so. There's far too much lost in the adaptation process to say that reading the comics is anything close to the experience of listening to the original. The story was great, but it wasn't all that made the Adventure Zone the Adventure Zone. But to be fair, repping the pod as a whole clearly wasn't the aim. Honestly, it's exactly what it's supposed to be, is the vibe of this entire adaptation. These books were created so fans of the Adventure Zone could get a kick out of seeing all the weird shit that happened in the D&D game rendered in art form, and yeah, it absolutely nails that. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers. Don't forget to do all those good YouTube things like commenting, liking, sharing, and offering up sacrifices to the Ancient Ones for my success. And hopefully I'll see you next time. Much love and appreciation to my patrons of honor, April Mack, Shelby Holtz, and Curtis Charles Jr. And a big thank you to this video's editor, Sophia Ricciardi. Links to her work in the video description. You know what? The little viewfinder was lying to me. I look fabulous. I should have had faith. Silly kitty cat. Now I've got to throw you out because you were being a little gremlin and you wouldn't stop. So, are these graphic novels exactly what it's supposed to be? Is the... Feed the cat soon.